We had a school out in Bangkok. Now it's closed because of the pandemic, so we're getting ready to relocate to Portland, hopefully by the end of the year, and start teaching students out there. And in the meantime, we've been doing online classes at our website, Faceting Apprentice. So that's a bit about me, but that's not what we're here to talk about. I want to talk about some history. You know, this has been my obsession for 2 years now, and it's really colorful and it's really fun. So I want to take you guys all the way back, even older than this guy, and we're going to go all the way back and see how all of this came about and why we're sitting in this room today. So here's our adventure for today. I'm going to take us back into pre-American gem cutting. So I figured if we want to understand how the story begins, we really need to understand what was going on before so that we know what the factors were for all these people that were starting this new community. We're going to check out the origin story, which is really somehow starting in Maine in the 1880s, and then from there we're going to jump all around the country. We're going to see how some of the early clubs started and what was going on in the minds of the people that were creating these clubs. We're going to watch it as it evolves through the wars, through the Depression, and see how it grows. We're going to see how the technology changes along the way from very, very crude homemade things to the very sophisticated machines that we have today. And finally, I will leave you guys in 1947, which is where my book's going to end, because if I go any further than that, the project will never end. I'll never be able to finish it. So this is our adventure for tonight. Now, before I get deep into the narrative, I like to just show this because it's good to think about the fact that this story of American cutting was not happening necessarily in any one spot. We can see, up over here we've got activity happening up in Maine. We've got stuff happening in New England and spreading down into the East Coast. We've got all the stuff happening out here in everywhere between LA and San Diego, and the earliest lapidary clubs, some of the earliest gem cutting machines, and then as we're going to see, spreading clubs all over the country, including up in Portland, where we've got some very important figures, some very important evolution of the craft. And then all alone down there in South Carolina, we've got G. Harry Howard, who's going to be one of the major characters of our story tonight. So keep this in mind as we go through, that we're going to be bouncing all over the country as we go through history. So let's talk a bit about what was going on in America before there was such thing as really an American gem cutter or a hobbyist gem cutter. So as we approach the 20th century, gem cutting in America looked a lot like gem cutting in Europe. Most of the people that were doing cutting would have probably almost exclusively been located in New York, and they would have looked like guys like this, using big furniture-sized hand-cranked benches that are identical, if not imported from machines that we see in London, in Paris, in Germany. And this guy in particular is in New York City, and you can see that he's using this type of jam peg, very old school 1800 style jam peg. And if we would look, the drawing of it, if we would compare this to the drawing of the lapidary machine in the Encyclopedia Britannica of the same period of time, it is the exact same machine. So we can't really tell a difference in the end of the 1800s between American cutting and European cutting. It's the same. But as you're going to see, things are going to quickly change. Now, as we go through this story, one of the most important things that we should think about is that as the technology grows and as the culture of gem cutting grows here in America, there's something very peculiar that's happening about the taste and aesthetic of the American cutting market and the American cutting movement. So if we look in Europe in the 1880s, for example, the major cut of that time is a mixed cut. So it's going to have a brilliant top, it's going to have a step cut bottom, it can be round, it can be oval, it can be cushion, it can be pear shaped, any shape really. This is the cut, it's the end all be all of gem cutting for colored stones. And if we would go to Europe today, nothing has changed. The cutters of Paris call this the Parisian cut or the French cut. The cutters of London call it the London cut. Every country claims this cut, and it's the standard. It's the industry standard cut for almost the whole world. But as we're going to go through the story of America, we're going to see that something unusual happens. We start to see almost immediately this early obsession with the brilliant cut and brilliance, the idea of brilliance in general. So when I was starting to, put together this research and this talk, I was trying to figure out, where does this come from? That, all of the rest of the world is focused on the mixed cut and bringing out color saturation, but in America it's all about sparkle and movement and reflection and everything like that. And so I started to dig into the literature, and I found almost a specific moment in time. 1903, we've got this book called Precious Stones by W.R. Cattell, and he's talking about a cutter in Boston named Passmore he says, he succeeded in preserving the color and enhancing the brilliancy of many fancy stones by cutting them entirely brilliant. He tells us later, this gentleman has done for colored stones what Henry D. Morse did for diamonds. If you guys don't know Henry Morse, he's the guy who started the American style of diamond cutting in Boston and totally changed the whole diamond cutting world. So comparing Passmore to Morse is kind of a big deal, because Morse is kind of a big deal. And it's very interesting that they're presenting this information as if it's something totally new. So we don't really have a lot of evidence before the 1890s of anybody cutting a full brilliant top and bottom colored stone. No one ever did that before. It's not something for a colored stone. It's a diamond cut. So how did this happen? This is my question. How did this happen? Why did this happen? Why would Passmore be obsessed with brilliant cuts? And why would the rest of the story that I'm going to tell be obsessed with the brilliant cuts? The answer, I think, comes from some of the marketing propaganda at the time. So if we look at what was going on, because of Morse and because of the other, new cutting styles that were coming out of Boston and New York, they're advertising these new styles, and they're showing us brilliance, brilliance, brilliance. They're showing it in pictures, they're telling us in words, they're using very bold marketing propaganda to really put this idea in our mind that the best cut is the brightest cut, it's the one that uses science, it's the one that uses the most up-to-date understanding of optics, and that's what was going on in the diamond industry here. But if you can imagine, if you're a wannabe gem cutter in the 1920s and you've been looking at magazines to learn, and you're seeing advertisements like this over and over and over again, this is 1903, these kind of ads continued up until the 20s and maybe even into the 30s. So if you're just seeing this kind of marketing slogans over and over again, you're starting to think, oh yeah, the best, the most modern. I want to be on the cutting edge of science. I'm going to do this. And I think this is why, for the next 100 years or until today, we see that the American cutters have always favored the brilliant cut as opposed to a step cut or a mixed cut. So this is the background premise of this story. So keep this in mind as we go. This is the kind of aesthetic transformation that's happening in the American world almost exclusively. So let us begin the story in Maine. So Maine, it turns out, is where some of, I would say the first cutters that we could really call American gem cutters come from. So Maine, if you don't know already, it has America's oldest colored stone mine, that's Mount Mica. So Mount Mica is where all the tourmalines from Maine comes from. They started mining in Mount Mica in 1820, and by the time we get to the 1880s, it's gone through a couple different hands. And in 1880, two guys are owning and running the mine. That's Loren Merrill, the guy in the middle, and his partner Kimball Stone. And so what they've been doing for the last 60 years is they're mining tourmalines up in Maine, and they're sending them down to these guys in New York with the hand-cranked jam pegs, and they're fastening the stones and sending them back up to Maine, and that's how business has been in Maine for 60 years. And by the time Loren Merrill comes to be the mine owner, they're starting to get a little bit disgruntled with their relationship with New York. So they're, like their predecessors, they've been sending these stones down to New York, but they're not happy with what's happening. And it could be because the cutters aren't really giving them the look that they're looking for. Maybe they're thinking that they're wasting the stones, they're wasting the weight. And I suspect that they're also wanting to play with this new idea of brilliance, and the cutters of New York, who are very old school, are not doing this. They're not into it. So Lauren Merrill decides that he is going to take his cutting into his own hands. And this is the first time that anybody in America has really ever decided to do this. Everything before this time has always been the old way, which is the master teaches the apprentice and everything stays in the company. You don't talk about it, you don't tell the secrets, and that's the way it goes. And so when these guys decided that they want to start gem cutting, they're looking at the cutters in New York, but the cutters in New York are not helping them out. They don't want them to know what they're doing or see too much. And also, the way that the cutters in New York work, like the cutters in Europe, this is a difficult job that takes many, many years to learn. So Lauren Merrill, who's been mining for 10 years already, is not going to take 5 years off and learn how to do jam peg cutting like those guys in New York. It's way too time consuming, and he's got a sort of a technical mindset where he's thinking, you know, I think that I could create something to help me do this faster and easier. I don't want to have to learn how to master the control of my hand so that this stick stays in the right place. So you can see that what he's developed is a sort of a mechanical mechanism to help him hold the stone and give him very specific angles and give him a very specific rotation. So he's sitting at his homemade machine right now. It's a big, huge table. You can see he's got his wheel right here that he's cutting on. Notice the big arc in the back. So this is his quadrant. It's giving him a big arm that goes around this arc and gives him an angle. And notice all of these round, weird-looking rods down here. These are his index gears. So he's got a bunch of different index gears that give him a bunch of different patterns that he can cut. And so I found these photos, you know, during my research during the pandemic, and I was like, man, I wonder I wonder if any of this stuff survives. I wonder if, you know, can we find any of this stuff? And so the first place that I went to when I started this trip was Maine. I was very, very excited to see what was in Maine. And I was so stunned to discover that this machine from the 1890s is still sitting there, literally 1 block away from where Lauren Merrill was cutting his stones. So this is that same machine, and you can see it a lot better in these modern photos. It's a big arc. Okay, it's almost 100 years old now, or it's more than 100 years old now, so it's kind of rusty, but we can still see we've got, there's a bunch of angles on here, the arm can move, and then notice this Tinker Toy looking index gear. So if anybody in here is a faceter, you might notice what I noticed as soon as I looked at this gear. I knew exactly what patterns he was cutting as soon as I looked at the holes. So round brilliant, exactly. You've got 8 holes in the middle. Halfway between those 8 holes in the middle, you've got 8 holes on the bottom, or on the top. That's going to make your mains and your stars. And then notice how at the top of the index gear, there's 16 little holes that are perfectly placed around the middle ones that are going to give you your brake facets. I couldn't believe this, because this is even before I thought that they were already thinking about the brilliant cut. So already in the 1880s or 1890s, Lauren Merrill has already built a machine specifically designed to help him cut the round brilliant. And then I was thinking, okay, here's all of those other gears. I'm thinking, oh, he's probably got all kinds of different designs in all these gears. No, they're all made for brilliant cuts, but he's stretched out the holes a little bit to make ovals and pears and cushions and everything else. So he's got a gear for every single design, whereas today we have one gear that we can use for every design. So a little bit of a different idea. So Lauren Merrill builds this machine. He takes him a couple years to figure it out, you know, get it all working and get his polish down. That was the one thing that he was having a hard time with. So he figures out how to do it, and that totally changes the whole industry in Maine. So they're now mining their own stones and cutting them in-house. And Lauren Merrill, unlike those cutters in London or Paris or Eder Oberstein or even New York, he's not trying to keep it a secret. He's not trying to keep it in the family. He's letting everybody in the community that wants to know, he's teaching them how to do it. And we start seeing over the next 10 years more cutters popping up in the towns around in Oxford County where the mine's at. So by the time we get into the end of the 1890s, there's like a dozen cutters up in Maine, and notice they're all using the same machine. There's an arc, there's this arm that sticks out with this index gear, and there's a whole new industry for the first time up in Maine. Now, down in Portland, this is a couple hours south of Oxford County, we've got William Cross. Now, William Cross started his days as a jeweler, a manufacturing jeweler. So he does commercial work, but he also makes his own tools. So he understands tool making, he understands how to work with metals, and he meets these guys, and he sees what they're doing, and he wants to start cutting too, but he's got new ideas. So we can see that he develops his own machine, this one that's in the middle here, and it's like a smaller, more compact, all-metal version. And by the time he starts playing, electricity has really come into its own, and he built his machine around an electric thing. So he doesn't have to have this big bench where he's kicking the plate to turn the wheel. So this is kind of like the second version of this machine. Now, by the time we get into the 1930s, all of these guys have put their head together. They like the machine, it's working well, but they have new ideas as they start talking, and they're thinking, we can make something even better. So they all come together and they build this final version, this version 3.0 of the machine. And notice it has a lot of the features of the old one. Big arc for the angles. We've got that same kind of index gear, though now it's metal, not wood. We've got a whole dopping system with a removable dop. It's even got a cheater, though we can't see it in this picture. And the one thing that they added that was missing from those other two versions, they now have a height control. So before they couldn't make the whole thing go up and down. So if you had a big stone or a small stone, your angle's going to be a little bit different because the dot will sit differently. Now they've solved that problem, and we have a machine that is almost as good as any machine that we would find and use today. The only problem is nobody knew that this was happening outside of Maine. So they're developing all this stuff over 30 years, but they're like in a bubble. I mean, Maine today is still in a bubble. You go into Maine and things are going on out there that no one knows, and they don't know what's necessarily going on out here. So the rest of our story is going to go on while these guys in Maine are using this stuff. So we'll keep that in mind. We'll come back to Maine later. So while the Maine guys are doing all this, we've got action down here in Southern California. So we've got this guy, F.A. Marcher. Him and his brother start a gem and lapidary shop in downtown Los Angeles in January 1st, 1901. And by 1903, he has patented two faceting machines, one in 1903, one in 1904. And notice that this faceting machine doesn't look anything like that machine in Maine. It doesn't have that big arc. It's not. It doesn't have like this quill sticking out. It looks very much similar to the kind of machines that we would see today. It's got a height control. It's got an index gear. It's got an angle dial. So it's really got all the controls that we need and all the stuff that we use today. And he patents this, and then they start using this. And one of them survives. I actually have this one that I think is one of the Marcher machines. And so him and his brother opened the shop in downtown LA, and they set up the shop so that when you walk in, it's a big glass front. When you walk in, all of the loose gems are in all these little bowls, and the sun is shining in on them. So when you walk in, you're overwhelmed with this rainbow of loose stones. And then along the side, you see there's all these gem cutters over there, doing cabs, and maybe they're doing faceted stones. It doesn't really look like it, but they've got all these grinding wheels that are powered off all these belts that are running off of a motor generator that's in the back. Notice they got a couple lights here and there, so we can see that electricity has made its way into the workplace now. This is a new thing. And so Marcher Brothers was one of the first shops where you could come in and get a loose stone, pick whatever stone you fancy, and then pick your mounting, and they would set it for you. And before this, nobody did that. You would just come in and buy a fully finished piece. And today, this is like a really common way of doing it. Lots of people do it that way. Marcher Brothers were maybe one of the first people to ever do that. So they start using their machine, and then over the next couple of years, we see a bunch of different iterations of the same idea. Now, I don't think that they're copying each other. It's just sort of like this moment in time where everybody has this idea. Suddenly, we can do gem cutting in a whole new way. People are getting inspired. You can see patents on the patents on the East Coast, patents on the West Coast, and for a lot of this period of time, we have most of the activity happening in New York and New England and down here in Southern California, and that's going to be how it is for a little bit of time. But even though we've got these new machines and we see that people are using them, whether they're up in Maine or down in Los Angeles, they're not really yet the ones that are having a big impact on the culture of American cutting. If we see ads from this time, we're still seeing the JamPegs. If we see articles and blurbs from this time, everything's still talking about those cutters in New York. So you can see that one on top is talking about Made and Lame. That's where all the gem cutters were in New York for that period of time. And articles from this period are talking about the commercial cutters that are still using those JamPegs. So it's still very much an old world industry when it comes to the commercial world, but that's going to change here soon. Once we get into the 19-teens, we start to see this new interest in the general public about earth science. So we're seeing new articles come out. We have magazines already, like the American Mineralogist. That's already been going for since the late 1800s. But this is a magazine that's sort of written by scientist types for scientist types. This is not a magazine for the common man. But we're starting to see other articles coming out, such as a suggested course in gemology. So this is Frank Wade. He's a chemistry teacher in Indianapolis who knows a lot about gemstones. And he starts writing this 27-part article that's coming out in one of the trade publications. And this is really the first time that the trade or just the general public is starting to have an ability to understand gemology and learning the science of gems, including this one I pulled out because he's talking about cutting in this particular issue. Eventually, this 27-part article, he expands upon it and releases it in book form. And this textbook of precious stones ends up becoming really, really important for the community of cutters that I'm about to tell you about. Because as they start learning more about cutting and they want to know more about stones, Wade is a guy that they can write letters to and access through his book. And it's very simple and easy to read. We also have guys like Herbert Whitlock, who's the curator of the Natural History Museum in New York, who's starting to put out some articles looking at how does the gem cutting work? How has it evolved over time? He's mostly looking at diamonds, but still we're seeing more, for the first time really, some information coming out about what is cutting and how does it work that's accessible for the common people, for anybody who's interested to find it. So things are growing, but then we have to go on pause for a moment because the world enters the war, and everything has to kind of slow down a bit, but we can see that from this article in the middle of the war in 1918, they're saying jewelry sales are good, and that part I highlighted over there, the lapidaries actually still have so much work that they're having a hard time supplying the demand because probably the war is affecting their ability to get rough and stuff like that. But despite the fact that we're in the war, things are still moving and the jewelry world is still alive. So move forward a little bit. Things are still moving really, really slow at this point. We don't really have anything yet happening that we can really call a community. We've got just a couple people here and there who are getting interested in cutting. Now, when we get into the middle of the 20s, we have Herbert Whitlock, that guy who's curating at the Natural History Museum, putting out this pamphlet. Now, this is not really an instruction manual of any kind. This is really just a very bare bones, what is gem cutting. This is the kind of pamphlet that you would get in the gift shop of the museum, and most of it's about diamond cutting, but he does show us a small chapter on colored stone cutting, but not very surprising, the cutters that he shows, because he's in New York, are those same JamPeg cutters. So in 1926, we can see the JamPeg cutter is still the dominant cutter of the commercial world of New York. So same year, 1926, we see the emergence of Rocks and Minerals magazine. So Peter Zodak is the editor. He's living in upstate New York, and he gets this idea that he's going to start something new. He tells us in the first issue where this idea came from. Why did he have the idea of putting out the magazine? He says, the idea of publishing a magazine devoted to minerals was first suggested to me through the large number of letters I received from collectors and would-be collectors who desired information on the subject, methods in analyzing minerals, hints on making a collection, and so forth. So many letters did I receive, and so keen was their interest, that I was oftentimes swamped with correspondence. As a solution, I finally decided a magazine on minerals would be just the thing. Now, Rocks and Minerals starts out, as he said, a magazine about collecting minerals and going out and finding them. But pretty quickly, he starts to realize that there is enough interest in the gem cutting idea that he starts a section of the magazine just for cutting, and Rocks and Minerals at this time is the most important thing for the birthing of the gem cutting community. It's really the only way that anybody can find out anything, and as it grows, we're going to see that it's going to become really, really important for this new gem cutting community. But before that happens, another disaster. Stock market crash. Now I put this in here as well as, realizing that there's bigger things happening here than gem cutting. World War I, the stock market crash. This is setting up the context for how this whole thing begins. The birth of American gem cutting is coming off the back of World War I and right in the middle of the Great Depression, and that's really important to understand for what's about to happen. So 2 months, okay, so now we're going to come into this period where the whole thing really starts happening quickly. So 2 months after the stock market crashes, we've got a letter in Rocks and Minerals. In the back of the magazine, we've got this guy who's going to be our hero tonight, J. Harry Howard. He writes a letter to the magazine. He says, "There are doubtless hundreds of men like myself who are more interested in cut and polish stones than in raw minerals, and who get a kick out of cutting them and polishing for themselves, but we don't know how. Can you find someone competent and willing to write such an article to be published in pamphlet form and sold to your subscribers, or to be published in the pages of Rocks and Minerals?" And there's a little note from the editor saying, we've had a bunch of letters like this recently, and this is kind of how people start thinking, oh, there's actually some interest here in gem cutting. So because Howard writes this letter and they publish it in the magazine, we start seeing a lot of other letters coming into the magazine, and they start giving Howard's address out. So Howard somehow becomes this focal point for this attention of building up knowledge about gem cutting. And we start to see letters coming in from all over the country. People on the West Coast, people in the East Coast, people in New England, even people up in Toronto and in parts of Canada. So slowly we're starting to see there's maybe 10 or 20 people around the country, including in Canada, who are really curious. They're going out, they're finding rocks, they want to polish them, but they don't know how. So they're doing all these experiments and building up their own gear, and they're sharing it with each other. Again, this is a really important thing, this sharing, because this is not something that happens anywhere else. Everywhere else it's always been such a secret, and in the DNA of the American lapidary community is the idea that we're going to keep it open. We're going to share. We're going to let everybody know what we're doing because it's going to bring the whole community up. And that's what they're doing here. Everybody is finding out a different piece of the puzzle. One guy figures out how to get the saw working. One guy figures out how to get the lap set up for polishing. One guy figures out how to do sapphires. Nobody can figure out sapphires at this time. And so within a couple of years, all these people are writing to Howard, and he's writing back to all of them. And within a couple of years, Howard becomes the guy that he's asking for in that letter. So he gets so much information at his fingertips that by 1931, just 2 or 3 years later, he's ready to put out that pamphlet that he was asking the editor for. So him and Zodak get together, and they decide they're going to put something out that's directly addressing this idea of how do we cut stones. Now, this is about 30 pages, so it's still something very small, something very new, but it's really the first thing that we've seen like this, something that actually shows us with photos and words and instructions, how do we do this? Most of the book's about cabbing. He doesn't really talk too much about faceting at all. Mostly at this time, they're saying, faceting is a little bit too complicated, we're not ready to think about that yet, we're still trying to get cabs under control, and sawing and drilling, and that's about as far as they're ready to go. But he does give us this appendix in the back of the book just to show what is faceting, what does it look like. And lo and behold, who does he show us but those cutters from Maine? So the connection here is Harvard. The guys in Maine have been communicating with Harvard because they need to understand more about mineralogy so they can learn how to polish. So they're contacting scientists at Harvard. Unfortunately, the guys at Harvard know nothing about polishing. They're just mineral collectors. They're running the museum and building up the collection. But the guys at Harvard know about the guys in Maine, and when Howard writes to the guys in Harvard, the guys in Harvard send them back these photos saying, oh, this is what we know, this is what we've seen, there's these cutters up in Maine. And so Howard publishes all these photos, and this is the first time that the bubble in Maine bursts. And everybody in Maine, or everybody in the rest of the country, gets a very small glimpse at what's going on in Maine and what the machines look like and how they're doing it. So remember, these machines that they developed in Maine, this is the first time anybody's had this idea of having some kind of angle thing and having some kind of rotating index to your thing. So this is very influential. So not only did he put out this pamphlet, he gets a column in Rocks and Minerals magazine. They sell that they sell that pamphlet so fast that they realize this is bigger than we thought it was. It's bigger than the 300 copies we printed. We need to make this a monthly series, and that's what they do. And Howard, being the focal point of all those letters and all that knowledge, becomes, the eye of the storm. It's all moving around him at this period of time. So he's writing his article. He's got his books circulating. He's still writing the letters, and some of these columns are just letters that come in. He just publishes them, and some of them are his own experiments. In the same year that he starts the column, we see the first advertisement for this faceting machine that he's developed, and you can actually order it. He's teamed up with this company that normally makes jewelry tools in New Jersey, and they're offering this machine that they call the Dixon Howard. So the tool company is called William Dixon, and they're combining it with Howard, so we got the Dixon Howard. Now, I'm going to come back to this machine in a little bit, but I just want to put it in here so that we know that in 1931, they're already starting to make the first faceting machine that you can actually order. This is interesting. This is new. So we're in the Depression, right? We're in the 30s. The whole time we're in the Depression, people are looking for something to do. A lot of people are out of work. A lot of people are out of money, but they're not idle, or they don't want to be idle. So one thing that I learned while I was doing this research, the whole idea of hobbies and the American thing about hobbies, this starts during the Depression. People are starting to look for things to do that maybe don't cost too much money. Joining a club, starting a garden, going out into the woods and finding rocks, beach combing, whatever it is, people are starting to do hobbies. And Scientific American picks up on this pretty quickly. We see 3 articles over 3 years, and they're telling about this new hobby, the amateur lapidary, the amateur gem cutting. What is it? How do we do it? Showing some pictures of the machines, showing some pictures of the stones, and really pushing this idea out, because Scientific American is a pretty big magazine. This isn't a niche Rocks and Minerals magazine. This is something that people of all types of intellectuality are reading, and they're really, starting to push this idea. Even Rocks and Minerals themselves is kind of tapping into this depression thing. This is one of the ads from the magazine saying, you don't need to be ashamed of these times. Even if you don't have any money, we can show you how to have an inexpensive hobby. All you need is a subscription to Rocks and Minerals. We're going to show you exactly how to build up a collection. Even something as cheap as $2 you can get in these hard times. And so we're seeing more and more interest in this new idea that someone could go out and get their own stone and become a gem cutter. Now, of course, the thing that starts happening is formation of clubs. So whether you're into pottery, or you're into gardening, or maybe you're into minerals and collecting, we're starting to see lots of different types of clubs being formed in America. And for our purposes, obviously, the most interesting types are the mineral clubs. So the first club of the West Coast, and really one of the first clubs in the whole country, is in Pasadena, California. So they form in 1931. They get a whole bunch of people together. They're meeting in the Pasadena Library, and they decide that they're going to go out and do their first field trip. So they go out into, somewhere around here. They're looking for whatever they're looking for, and within a couple of months, they already have the idea that they need to have a newsletter. They're going to have some photos in the newsletter. They're going to talk about their field trip. They're going to show this picture of the first time that any mineral club has gone out and done this kind of rock hounding adventure. And this is really where it all begins, Pasadena. And the magazine, Rocks and Minerals, is very much advocating this. If you're into this, somebody else in your community is into this, get together, make a club. And so we see, I think this is October 1931, they put this first newsletter out, and this is the first newsletter of the whole thing. There are no lapidary or mineral club newsletters before this. And if we look in the back of the issue, already there is an advertisement for who else but the Marcher Brothers. So those gem cutters in downtown LA. So we can see that those guys were already so tapped into the community that even in the first newsletter, they already knew they were in it, they were on it, and they knew, okay, if you guys are going out and finding stones, bring them to us. We'll cut them for you, because there wasn't anybody, to know how to do it yet. So while these guys are meeting in Pasadena, a couple miles away, we got Robert Shipley downtown, who's starting to get this idea that he's going to start his own school. So he's just come back from Europe. He's done his Gem A course. He's full of gemological knowledge, and he opens the first GIA campus. So he's got a little laboratory, little classroom, and I thought it was really interesting. In the first year that GIA opened, they already had a correspondence course ready to go. So if you weren't in LA, but you wanted to start learning about gems or learning about gemology, you could already start taking the distance learning course, which is how I did my GIA. So I think that's really cool that they were already doing that in the first year. And we can see that GIA, obviously, it was a good idea. I mean, it's one of the biggest schools and one of the biggest labs all around the world today. Everybody knows GIA. So Shipley was definitely onto something. This idea that we're going to take the jewelers who really don't know very much about gems, and we're going to teach them about gemology, and we're going to be open to anybody that wants to come and learn. And really, they sort of changed the world, at least changed the world here, because we had no other way of learning gemology yet. So this is all going on down here, and over the next couple years, we start to see more and more clubs popping up. Most of them are on the West Coast at the beginning, but we start to see more and more happening around the country, whether that be in the mountains, Sacramento, or wherever it may be. New clubs are forming. New interest is bubbling up, and people are buzzing about this. People are buzzing so much that they need more to consume. They need more information. And so one of the clubs that we see, one of these early clubs that forms, is up in Portland, the Oregon Agate and Mineral Society in 1933. So H.C. Dake was their first president, and he was also the guy that was in charge of doing their first newsletter. So he starts their newsletter, which is the Oregon Mineralogist, but almost within a year, it becomes so big and so popular that not just people in the Oregon Agate Club are reading it, but people all over the country find out about it, and they want to get it. So they decided they're going to turn their club newsletter into a proper actual magazine. They drop the Oregon and just change it to the Mineralogist, and the Mineralogist becomes one of the most important magazines for minerals and for cutting for like the next 50 years. So this is going on, and they become the official organ for about 20 different clubs up and down the West Coast, including the San Francisco club that I came out of. So they were representing all these different clubs, and when you look in the back of the magazine, you would see this whole section on club happenings, and it wasn't just clubs in Oregon, it was clubs all up and down the West Coast, and throughout America where people wanted their new stuff to be in the Mineralogist. So now we've got two magazines, Rocks and Minerals and the Mineralogist, that are supporting this new club system. So as we go through the 30s, we're seeing more and more clubs pop up, and we're seeing some new clubs splinter off of the mineralogy clubs, some clubs that are specifically devoted to lapidary. So we've got mineral clubs now, we've got mineral and gem and lapidary clubs, and then we've got some clubs that are just exclusively, we want to cut the stones. We don't care about mineral collections or whatever, we want to cut the stones. And so we're starting to see this fire building up. Now, right in the middle of the 1930s, the return of Howard. So he wrote that letter in 1929. He put out his pamphlet in 1931. By 1935, he's already been doing his magazine column for 4 years, and he has truly become the expert, the influencer of his time, but he has really become the guy that he was asking for back in that letter in 1929. He's written the pamphlet, he's written the article, now he's written the book. This is about a 250-page book, truly the first full instruction manual. So he's looking at cabbing, beading, sawing, drilling, and faceting. So he's got a whole chapter on faceting, and he's showing us, surprise, surprise, the only cut that he walks us through the whole thing, the round brilliant. So we can see, we saw it in Maine, we're seeing it here in this first instruction manual. And the ethos of the book, again, it's this idea of sharing. He tells us in the beginning of the book, this isn't all me. This isn't all my idea. He's like, I've been writing letters to all these different people, and this book is really the summation of all of the cutters of America, bringing all their ideas together. So the amateur gem cutter writing and teaching for the amateur gem cutter. And that's really, blueprinting this into the spirit of what's happening all the way until today. So he's showing us some of the different designs at the time. He's showing us how to cut the round brilliant, how to walk through the faceting pattern. He's also showing us, coming back to his machine. So I'm looking at this machine. It's very, very quirky, right? If anybody in here facets, you know that this is a weird looking machine. It doesn't look like anything else. It's got a vertical wheel. It's got this weird arc system over here. It's very, very simple. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, wow, man, Howard must be a genius. He's like invented something that nobody ever thought about before. But then as I get deeper into that main research, I'm looking at this more and more, and I'm like, wait a minute, this looks familiar. If you turn this thing sideways, it looks a lot like the main machine. So he tells us in the book, so remember, we're in the middle of the Great Depression, right? Howard is not destitute. He's an electrical engineer. He didn't lose his job, but he's still not trying to put a bunch of money into his lapidary setup that he's building. He already had a bench grinder in his basement that he wanted to use, which is that piece over there. So instead of building a whole new machine that's going to work on a horizontal lap like most everybody else is using, he's thinking, okay, I already have the grinding thing. I just need to build something to help me hold the stones. He sees these pictures from Maine, and he flips their design on its side so that he can use his vertical grinder, but everything else is pretty much the same. He's got his index gear here, he's got his dock release system here, he's got the big arc, though he's turned it sideways now, and he's got his index gear, though his index is only 16 teeth. So if anybody here has tried to cut a round brilliant, it's not very easy to do it with 16 teeth because there's not enough teeth to do a round brilliant. So he tells us, in order to do the round brilliant, the teeth can do the main facets and the stars, but to do the break facets at the bottom, he has to cheat every single facet in, which is probably a nightmare on this crude machine. But cheat a little bit left, do half, cheat a little bit right, do half. So Howard puts out this book. So now this is the second time that the general public has seen a design like this with this arc system and this angles and index thing. And surprisingly, though, he doesn't really have a lot of influence on the technological culture of America. We don't see very many people copying the style that Howard was using. We do see it in a couple of places. This is out of one of those Scientific American articles, and we can see a very similar type of design. And I found one more picture over here of a guy in New York who's also using this sort of big arc system with the rotating index. But most of the people that we see around America at this time are starting to use what the guys in LA were using, a sort of upright mass that has an arm that goes up and down without the big arc and everything like that. So Howard's influence here isn't as strong, but for the rest of it, learning how to cut, learning how to cap, this book is hugely influential. Everybody's reading it. Everybody who wants to learn how to cut is going to get this book. It's the first book of its kind. There are literally no books that come out before this anywhere in the world that have step-by-step instructions, because as I said, it's always been a secret. Who's going to write that book? The master cutters of London aren't going to do it because they don't want anyone else to know. The guys in Eder Oberstein aren't going to do it because they don't even want their neighbors to know. It's only in America where we see someone who figures out their own way to do it, and a very unique way to do it, because nobody in Europe ever thought to build a device like this, and just put out all the information. But the thing about Howard's book, it's really focused on all aspects of the lapidary, but it's a little bit weak on the faceting side. I think at this point Howard wasn't a very good faceter yet. But as we move into the next chapter of our story, we're going to see that these guys in Portland are really going to pick up where Howard leaves off. They're building this very beautiful studio in downtown Portland. They're calling it their gem cutting laboratory. And you can see we've got grinders, we've got all the abrasive powders and polishing stuff back there. And then up front, right in the front and center, we've got a brand new style of masked machine. And it's going to be the mineralogists who are really going to push the faceting art into the next level. So we're going to go from a time where you have to build everything yourself. Anybody that wanted to do anything in the early 30s, you need to be an engineer to do it. You're going to have to know how to work with metal and build your own stuff. And this is going to start to change here as we get into the late 30s and into the 40s. So we can see that as we get into the late 30s, technology is starting to develop faster. The Mineralogist has a whole series. Almost every month they're kind of keeping an update on what's new in the world of faceting, and they're trying out all these different kinds of new machines that people are developing. And these look a lot like the ones that we saw back in 1903 in LA. So this style is really catching on, even all the way up in Portland. So they're trying them out, and they're saying for 1936 the best machine that they tried is the Klinefelter. Now this is a machine that nobody remembers today. I've never even found one. I met one guy, very old guy up in Portland, who told me when he first started, like back in the 50s, he called Klinefelter to get a machine, and he had just died. So he never actually even got one. So this is really out of living memory. But we can see that there's new machines being developed by different people. The Klinefelter, we've got the John's Gem Cutter over here. And we can see also from some of the advertisements of the period that some of the jewelry tool companies are starting to realize that, hey, there's something going on here with this lapidary stuff. This is worth some of our time. This is worth some of our energy. This is worth some of our advertising. And we can see that in the Rocks and Minerals magazine, they've rebranded themselves from William Dixon Tool Company to Dixon Lapidary, and now they're selling gem cutting tools, faceting machines, corundum, all the different, powdered corundum, all the different stuff that the cutters of that time were using to learn how to polish stone. So they're getting in on it right away. And as we go through the 30s, we're going to see more and more types of machines being developed. Now, at this time, we don't know yet what's the definitive style of machine that's going to take hold. Everybody who wants to facet is just inventing something new, and we can see that all of them look really different. If we look at all the machines today, they mostly follow the same idea, and they almost all look vaguely similar. These ones look radically different. We've got all different types of ideas. Some people are even playing with the jam peg over there, and everybody is just brainstorming, and it's like this very exciting moment in the world of cutting. What's going to be, what's the one that's going to take root? We don't know yet. Coming into the late 30s, we've got the next big book. So 1935, Howard put out his amateur lapidary book that was really influential, but wasn't super strong on the faceting. Now we've got Fred Young, who's one of the writers for the Mineralogist, the guy who's been running that gem cutting laboratory up in Portland. So he's been writing to all the people, he's been writing all the articles, and he's been experimenting and trying all the new tech. So when he puts his book out, The Art of Gem Cutting Complete, this is like the next big moment in gem cutting American history, because now everybody has a sort of upgraded guide. If you want to get into faceting, you're going to need this book. He's telling you all the information, showing you all the different styles of cutting, looking at angles, looking at the tech, looking at the new ways of, starting to use new kinds of grinding abrasives and all this kind of stuff. And it's very, very exciting. We can see it, we can feel it building and bubbling, and, it's becoming very, very active. And then, pause again. America enters the war. Now, this is a lot more, I would say, devastating for the community than it was for World War I. World War I, for the world of gem cutting, it didn't have that much effect because there really wasn't much of a community yet, right? We just had a couple of people here and there that were thinking about cutting. Now, by the time that we're entering World War II, we've got like 500,000 people that are organized into clubs all around the country that are reading Rocks and Minerals, that are reading the Mineralogist, and that are building their own machines. And all of that gets put on pause. If you want a faceting machine during World War II, forget about it. All the metals being rationed, all the natural materials and the resources are all being diverted towards the war effort. And even some of the gem cutters themselves are being diverted away from cutting work and commercial cutting work into doing this type of war work where they're, building ball bearings made out of agates. They're building all kinds of different stuff in New York, in LA, and in Europe as well. I met a lot of gem cutters in Europe that told me stories of the generation before them, showing me all these different pieces that they made for, different various functions of the war that were made out of minerals, made out of stones. So everything gets put on pause for a minute, a couple years really. There's still clubs forming and there's still clubs meeting, but things are a little bit weird for a couple of years. I think we can understand this a little bit because things have been weird here for a couple of years. We can probably relate to it more than we ever could before. But the cool thing that happens coming out of World War II, we have a whole bunch of new tech. A lot of stuff was invented and evolved during the war that eventually trickles down into the gem cutting world. Electroplating was invented during World War II, and we get a lot of electroplated laps coming into the gem cutting world after that happens. Synthetic diamond comes just a little bit after this, and when that comes into the community, that's going to be a game changer. But probably the most visual, interesting thing that comes out of this is all this, everything's been on pause. We got this energy that's being held for a second, for a couple of years. So once everybody comes back to normal and everybody's coming back from the war, and they're looking for how are they going to spend their free time, we have all these ideas that have been pent up for a couple of years, and we have this huge number of machines that come out in the 1940s. And again, we still don't know what's the dominant style. Is it going to be a masked machine? Is it going to be some kind of interesting handpiece? Are we going to play with this sort of jam peg, modern jam peg version? We don't know. And a lot of the machines that came out during this time, especially these four, are ones that really no one today would remember. If we look in the advertisements of the magazines from the early 40s, there must be 30 or 40 different manufacturers of gem cutting machines. Today there's like 4. So it must have been such an interesting moment to just be involved in this community. So much is happening, there's so many choices, so much talk and innovation happening, and so many machines are coming out, including ones that we still do remember today, like the MDR, which was coming out of this particular area, and which people today still use, like Meg. We've got, and MDR, which started in the late 40s, went all the way until, 2021? 2001 or 05, yeah. So, MDR, which was one of the first mass manufactured machines that you could buy in this style, hugely influential because it was just there for so many years. Same as the Graves. The Graves started in 1946. They just stopped making machines like 2 years ago. So, they're almost, 90 years going. And then other ones that we don't remember so much. The O'Brien is one that we've probably forgotten about. But if there's any old timers in here that learned cutting back in the 70s, probably a lot of people would have learned or at least seen a Taylor machine, because those ones were still pretty popular up until the 70s and 80s. So the last, and you can see, very, very interesting time. The community is growing. The types of technology are evolving. What we're able to use as far as, grinding and the abrasives and stuff is expanding and evolving as well. And the last big thing that happens that's going to close out our story tonight is 1947, the birth of Lapidary Journal. So we've got Leland Quick. Leland Quick was living, I think a couple hours east of here. He had an article, a column in Desert Magazine for a bunch of years, and like the magazines that came before him, he started to realize, there's so much interest in gem cutting. People keep writing to me, people keep asking, and people want to know more, that he decides that there's enough interest that we can have a whole magazine dedicated just to cutting. It's not a mineral magazine, it's not a rock hounding magazine, it's not a scientific magazine, it is a magazine written by cutters, written for cutters, where you can come to learn what's the newest kind of lapidary wheels, what's the newest gear, where people are doing their field trips at, what are the new clubs, what's happening in the museums or the Federation shows or whatever, all the stuff that goes on starting in 1947, you can find it in the pages of Lapidary Journal. And Lapidary Journal now becomes one of these pillars, like the Mineralogist and like Rocks and Minerals. These things that are really bringing the whole community of American cutting together in a way that they can communicate and coordinate, and something that's inspiring people to, find the other people, find the club, learn how to cut, whether you're making your own machine or you can just buy it from the advertisers in the magazine, it's all in here. And this is really the thing that's taking us into the next generation of people. The pioneering moment of gem cutting is pretty much over now, and we're in full-fledged action mode now, what I call the golden age of American cutting. Starting in the late 40s and on and on and on, we're seeing so many new clubs popping up, so many new machines coming out, and the Lapidary Journal is the thing that everybody almost connects to. And the Lapidary Journal, starting in 1947, only stopped printing during COVID. 2022 is when they printed their last issue. So this is an incredible run of a magazine that really helped keep the whole community alive and coordinated and connected and evolving. So this is where I have to stop, because if I wanted to talk about anything after this, we need at least 2 more hours. And I don't think any of us want to do that. So I just want to take a moment to end the talk to kind of just have a moment of appreciation and remembrance of those pioneers that really did the work in that period of time that enabled for all of this other stuff to happen, so that we can be sitting here today in a mineral club, with a lapidary department, and with a group of like-minded people that are interested in rocks and gems and minerals and cutting. So those guys are Lauren Merrill, our champion inventor of the first faceting machine in Maine, who brings us angles and indexes and helps us to go into this whole story. We've got Frank Marcher down in Los Angeles, who patents the first faceting machine that we see in American history, and maybe is the first person to ever use this sort of mass-style machine. We've got Peter Zodak in upstate New York, who starts Rocks and Minerals and creates one of those very important pillar magazines that really helps the community organize and communicate together. We've got Frank Wade in Indianapolis, who's writing his books, he's writing his articles, and he's really the gemological resource that all of the cutters who are writing letters to each other are writing letters to him, so that they can understand what's going on in this, inside the stones, in the gemology. We've got our supreme influencer, J. Harry Howard, who writes his letter so that he's enabled to get his pamphlet, his magazine article, his faceting machine made, and finally his book in 1935. Probably the most influential person in the whole story of American gem cutting, because those magazines and books in those early periods are really the thing that helps, kindle this fire that turns into, something that was only about a dozen people when he started to, hundreds of thousands of people today that are all around America, going to lapidary clubs and in the forums and cutting stones and whatever. We've got Dake and Young of the Mineralogists up in Portland, who are really pushing the art of faceting forward and sharing what they're figuring out through the Mineralogist magazine. And finally, we've got Leland Quick, who's writing in Desert Magazine and then forming Lapidary Journal, probably the most important magazine ever made in the world of rocks and minerals in America. So these are our founding fathers. Without them, we would not be able to be here. None of this would have happened, or at least none of it would have happened like this. So that's my story. Thank you guys for being such an attentive audience. And I'm happy to answer some questions if you have them.